32 SR-71 Blackbirds were built. 12 were lost in accidents. Not one was ever shot down, not by a fighter, not by a missile, not by the Soviet Union, not by anyone. And over Vietnam, where North Vietnamese crews fired about 800 surface-to-air missiles at SR-71S, not a single one hit. That is not luck. That is engineering. That is tactics. That is an airplane so fast and so high that the normal rules of interception began to break down. Now picture the scene over the cold northern seas. A black shape is crossing the edge of Soviet attention. It is at roughly 85,000 feet. It is cruising at Mach 3.2. Inside are two Americans, a pilot up front, a reconnaissance systems officer behind him. The jet is the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, and from Soviet bases the answer is launched. The MiG-25 Foxbat. For years the West had feared that machine. It looked brutal, it looked fast. It looked like the Soviet answer to everything America could put in the sky. But when Soviet pilots tried to reach the Blackbird over the Baltic, radar told the same story again and again. The Foxbat climbed, it strained upward, it got to about 62,000 feet, and then the gap remained. The SR-71 stayed above, the SR-71 stayed ahead. The MiG-25 got close enough to prove it was trying, then it fell behind. That was the humiliation. Not a dramatic dogfight, not a Hollywood duel, just altitude, speed, heat, fuel, guidance, materials, and an American aircraft that turned the enemy's best interceptor into a spectator. The Soviet pilot could look up, he could chase, he could follow for a moment, but he could not catch it. And after 1976, the reason became clearer than ever. On September 6th of that year, Soviet Lieutenant Viktor Belenko flew a MiG-25P from near Vladivostok to Hakodate, Japan, and defected. The prize he brought with him was not just a pilot, it was the airplane, the machine the West had been studying from a distance, the machine that had inspired fear. The machine meant to climb into the path of threats like the SR-71. CIA Director George H.W. Bush called the examination an intelligence bonanza, because inside that aircraft, the West found the truth. The Foxbat was not the futuristic superfighter many had imagined. About 80% of its fuselage was welded nickel steel, not advanced titanium alloys, not some miracle Soviet metal answer. Welded nickel steel. Built that way because the Soviet Union did not have the industrial capacity to produce titanium in the quantity required. The jet depended on vacuum tubes. It had limited maneuverability, and if its engines were held at Mach 3.2, they could destroy themselves. That number matters. Mach 3.2 was where the SR-71 lived. For the Blackbird, Mach 3.2 was an operational cruise speed. For the Foxbat, holding that kind of speed could ruin the engines. That was the difference. One aircraft was designed to survive the environment. The other was designed to make a desperate dash into it. The first escalation was speed. Because the SR-71 did not merely fly fast, it made speed its shield. The Blackbird's standard tactic against a surface-to-air missile was almost absurdly simple. Accelerate, outrun the missile. That was the tactic. Not a tight turn, not a dive into the weeds, not a last-second roll, just add power. Let the aircraft do what it was born to do. In many cases, accelerating alone was enough to evade a SAM. That sentence still sounds unreal. A missile is launched. The crew knows the threat is there, and the solution is not to fight the missile. It is to leave. The SR-71 could cruise at Mach 3.2 at about 85,000 feet. Its maximum recorded test speed was Mach 3.4, and one pilot reported exceeding Mach 3.5 during an operational mission while evading a missile over Libya. That is the world the Soviet interceptors were trying to enter. At those speeds, everything becomes unforgiving. A small error grows quickly. A small gap becomes miles. A weapon system that works on paper begins to fail in the sky. For the men inside the SR-71, speed was not a number for a brochure, it was survival. A pilot and an RSO sat in pressure suits, moving through the upper edge of the atmosphere, where the aircraft's black skin heated, expanded, and endured conditions that would punish ordinary machines. They were not there to dogfight, they were there to collect information, to cross a dangerous edge, to come home. And the airplane gave them a tool no interceptor could easily answer: distance. Every second at Mach 3 was distance. Every second at 85,000 feet was separation. Every second the enemy took to climb, accelerate, calculate, and guide, the Blackbird was already somewhere else. The Soviet pilot in a MiG-25 had a brutal task. He had to launch, climb, accelerate, get into a narrow piece of sky, and hope the geometry worked. But the SR-71 did not have to cooperate. It did not need to turn toward him. It did not need to slow down. It did not need to offer a clean, comfortable intercept. It simply continued, fast, high, coldly efficient. Over the Baltic, Swedish radar watched this contest unfold. The Foxbats rose again and again to meet the American aircraft. They tried to intercept, but the Soviet jets never got closer than about 10,000 feet below the Lockheed, and then they soon fell behind. That is a devastating phrase, soon fell behind, because an interceptor is supposed to close the distance, it is supposed to arrive, it is supposed to force the target to react. But here, the target barely had to respect the chase. At first, SR-71 crews treated the Foxbat with caution. That was professional. You do not dismiss an enemy aircraft because your aircraft is famous. You trust procedures, you trust performance, you watch the threat. But after repeated attempts, the pattern became clear. The MiG-25 was not getting there. The Foxbat was fast. It was powerful. It could climb. But it was not enough. Not against the Blackbird at its working altitude and speed. The second escalation was altitude, because the SR-71 was not simply running away forward, it was also living above the intercept. The Blackbird's operational cruise was around 85,000 feet, about 26,000 meters. At that height, the sky is thin, engines breathe differently, control surfaces respond differently, weapons behave differently. The margin between possible and impossible becomes razor thin. The MiG-25 could climb high. That was part of why the West had feared it. Over the Baltic, it regularly rose to around 62,000 feet. That is a serious altitude, higher than airliners, higher than most combat aircraft operate. But against the SR-71, it was still looking up, and looking up is not the same as intercepting. The Soviet pilot was fighting the geometry of a vertical gap and a horizontal gap at the same time. The SR-71 was above, the SR-71 was ahead, and the clock was brutal. At Mach 3, a delay of seconds matters, a radar track that is slightly late matters, a missile that cannot adjust fast enough matters, a fighter that arrives a little low matters. This was not a contest of courage. Soviet pilots could be aggressive, they could be disciplined, they could push their aircraft hard, but courage does not change physics, and physics favored the Blackbird. The missile problem was even worse. Analyses of why the MiG-25 could not catch the SR-71 point to 3 hard limits. First, the Foxbat's missiles were useless above roughly 27,000 meters, while the SR-71 operated at the high altitudes that made the shot ineffective. Second, in a tail chase, the MiG-25 did not have the speed to run down the Blackbird from behind. Third, in a head-on engagement, guidance could not adjust to the extreme closing speed. That is the trap. From behind, it cannot catch. From ahead, it cannot guide. From below, it cannot reach. The Soviet system had built a machine that looked terrifying on the ramp, but the SR-71 did not meet it on the ramp. It met it in the upper atmosphere, at speed, on American terms. The Blackbird forced the enemy to fight a kind of duel that punished every weakness. If the MiG-25 tried to climb, the SR-71 was already higher. If it tried to chase, the SR-71 was already faster in the way that mattered. If it tried to depend on missiles, the altitude and closure problems turned the weapon into a promise it could not keep. This is why the Baltic attempts are so revealing. They were not isolated moments, they were a pattern. Radar saw the attempts. The Soviet jets came up, the Lockheed kept going. The MiGs dropped out of the race, again, and again, and again. A few kilometers can sound small on a map. 10,000 feet can sound manageable when spoken calmly. But in an intercept at the edge of the atmosphere, that gap is everything. It is the difference between a firing solution and frustration, the difference between control and helplessness, the difference between a threat and a witness. For the American crew, the moment was tense, but the aircraft had been built for that tension. The pilot managed the machine, the RSO managed the sensors, navigation and mission systems. They worked as a pair, no wasted motion, no drama for the sake of drama. They were inside one of the most demanding aircraft ever flown, and the enemy's best answer was falling away behind them. That image matters, because the SR-71 was not invulnerable by magic. It survived because an entire chain worked: design, materials, engines, training, mission planning, crew discipline, maintenance, and a tactical doctrine that understood what the airplane could do better than anything chasing it. Accelerate, climb into the problem, let speed and altitude break the engagement. This was American technical confidence made visible, not loud, not boastful, just decisive. The third escalation came in 1976, because until Belenko landed in Japan, the West had been judging the Foxbat partly by what it feared it might be. Then the airplane was opened, measured, studied, and the myth cracked. On September 6, 1976, Belenko took off in a MiG-25P near Vladivostok. He flew to Hakodate, Japan. His defection instantly became one of the Cold War's most important intelligence moments. The aircraft was examined by the West. George H.W. Bush called it an intelligence bonanza, and for good reason. The inspection showed that the Foxbat was a very different machine from the nightmare many had imagined. It had impressive straight-line performance. It had a powerful roll, but it was not a balanced superfighter. It was not a sleek titanium marvel. Roughly 80% of its fuselage was welded nickel steel. That fact is astonishing because of what the West had expected. The assumption had been advanced materials, a bold titanium structure, a sign that Soviet industry had solved the same extreme temperature problem in a more elegant way. Instead, the MiG-25 revealed a harsher truth. The Soviet Union used welded nickel steel because it had to. It lacked the industrial capacity to produce enough titanium for the aircraft. That is not just a materials note. That is a national industrial limitation exposed in metal. The Foxbat also relied on vacuum tubes. To some viewers, that sounds primitive. But the point is not to laugh at a component. The point is contrast. The Soviet aircraft carried the burden of its industrial system. The SR-71 represented an American solution refined for a specific, brutal mission. Sustain Mach 3 flight, operate high, avoid the intercept envelope, get the crew home. The MiG-25 could touch frightening speeds, but holding Mach 3.2 could destroy its engines. The Blackbird cruised there operationally. That is not a small difference. That is the whole story. One side built a sprinter that could tear itself apart if pushed too long. The other built a long-distance runner for the edge of space. The Foxbat's role, after the inspection, became more understandable. It was no longer the mysterious superfighter of Western imagination. It became a known quantity, a machine with limited maneuverability, a machine with strengths, a machine with limits, an aircraft better understood as a specialized threat, including the role often described as an AWACS killer. rather than a magic answer to every American aircraft. And once the West understood those limits, the Baltic chases made even more sense. The MiG-25 had not failed because Soviet pilots were asleep. It failed because the mission was asking too much. Catch a blackbird from behind? The Foxbat lacked the needed speed in that situation. Shoot from above the useful missile envelope? The missile problem remained. Take a head-on shot. Guidance struggled with the extreme closing speed. It was a locked door with 3 locks. The SR-71 held the keys: speed, altitude, tactics. That is why the Soviet experience was so frustrating. They had the aircraft everyone feared. They had pilots ready to scramble. They had radars watching the sky. They had missiles designed for interception. And still, the American jet crossed the edge of their world and left. Over the Baltic, the MiG-25s came up like challengers. They reached, they strained, they briefly occupied the same vast sky. Then the Blackbird walked away at Mach 3. There is something almost unfair about it, but it was not unfair. It was earned by engineers who understood heat, earned by crews who trusted procedures, earned by maintainers who prepared a machine that operated where few aircraft could breathe, earned by planners who knew that the safest way through danger was not always stealth in the modern sense. Sometimes it was speed so overwhelming that the enemy's timeline collapsed. The SR-71 was not invisible. It could be detected, it could be tracked, it could be challenged. But detection is not destruction. Tracking is not interception. Seeing the Blackbird was not the same as catching it. That was the cruel lesson for the Foxbat crews. They could know it was there. They could rise toward it. They could point weapons and systems in its direction. But the engagement had to close, and it did not close. The difference between we see it and we can stop it was the distance where American engineering lived. The same lesson had appeared elsewhere. In Vietnam, around 800 SAMs were fired at SR-71s. None hit. Not because the missiles did not matter. They mattered. Every launch mattered to the crew. Every warning demanded action. But the Blackbird's answer was built into the aircraft: accelerate, outrun, survive. That record is staggering. 32 aircraft built, 12 lost in accidents, none to enemy action. No SR-71 was ever shot down. For a military aircraft that operated in dangerous skies during the Cold War against alert defenses, that record still feels almost impossible. But it is real, and it is the result of a design philosophy that refused to compromise the mission. The Blackbird did not pretend to be everything. It was not a dogfighter. It was not a bomber. It was not built to loiter low and slow. It had a purpose: go high, go fast, gather intelligence, come home. The MiG-25 also had a purpose. It was built around speed and interception. But when placed against the SR-71, its strengths were not enough to solve the problem. That is the heart of the story. A feared Soviet interceptor met an American reconnaissance aircraft in the one arena where the American machine was almost untouchable, and the interceptor discovered that being fast is not the same as being fast enough. The SR-71's cruising speed, Mach 3.2, was not a panic setting. It was normal operating life. The MiG-25's relationship with that speed was different. Push too hard, hold too long, and the engines could destroy themselves. That is the kind of difference that only appears when metal is tested. Not in a parade, not in a propaganda poster. In the sky, at altitude, with seconds disappearing. That is why Belenko's defection mattered beyond the intelligence files. It explained the chase. It showed the inside of the machine that had been trying to catch the Blackbird. It revealed a powerful aircraft, yes, but also an aircraft with compromises. Steel where many expected titanium, vacuum tubes where many expected something more advanced, limited maneuverability, engines with a dangerous limit at the very speed where the SR-71 was comfortable. The Soviet pilots were not chasing a rumor anymore. They were chasing a masterpiece, and the masterpiece had been tuned to defeat them. The Americans inside the Blackbird did not need to see the Foxbat as a monster after enough encounters. They had watched the pattern. The MiGs rose. They stayed below. They fell behind. After the early caution, SR-71 pilots stopped treating the Foxbat as a serious threat in that setting. That does not mean they became careless. No professional crew becomes careless at Mach 3. It means the evidence had become overwhelming. The enemy could try, but the geometry did not favor him, and when geometry, machinery, and tactics all point one way, the outcome becomes predictable. Imagine being the Soviet pilot. You are launched to intercept. You climb hard. Your aircraft is one of the fastest in your inventory. The radar picture says the American is there. You know the mission. You know the pressure. Then the numbers refuse to help you. The Blackbird is too high. The Blackbird is moving too fast. The window is closing before it opens. You are not losing because you hesitated. You are losing because the other aircraft was designed around a higher standard of sustained performance. That is the astonishment at the center of the story. Not admiration for the Soviet system. Not glory for the enemy. Astonishment at the gap. The MiG-25 was a serious machine. But the SR-71 exposed what seriousness was not enough to do. The Blackbird forced the Foxbat to reveal its limits, and Belenko's defection gave the West the documents, metal, systems and measurements to understand those limits in detail. Even today, one of the artifacts connected to that moment remains simple and human. Belenko's Soviet military identity document is preserved by the CIA Museum. A small document, a huge intelligence turning point. Because behind that identity card was the aircraft he brought with him. And behind that aircraft was the answer to years of fear. The Soviet interceptor could climb, but not high enough. It could run, but not in the right way, for long enough. It could carry missiles, but the missile envelope failed against the Blackbird's altitude, speed, and approach geometry. So the SR-71 kept flying. Baltic radar watched. Soviet jets climbed. American crews continued. And again, the enemy fell behind. This is why the Blackbird's legend is not just about speed records. Records are clean. Missions are messy. The legend comes from what happened when the aeroplane was challenged, when missiles rose, when interceptors scrambled, when hostile systems tried to turn a radar track into a kill. The SR-71's answer was almost always the same: more speed, more distance, more altitude, then home. That is a very American kind of triumph. Not because it was easy, because it was engineered. It took industry, it took risk, it took disciplined crews, it took a nation willing to build a machine for an extreme mission, then train people to use it at the edge of the possible. The Soviet Foxbat pilots did what their system asked. They launched into the chase. But the Blackbird had already changed the rules. At 85,000 feet and Mach 3.2, the SR-71 was not just flying through enemy attention, it was outrunning the enemy's ability to respond. And that is the payoff. The Soviets built a jet to catch the impossible. America built the impossible, and it came home every time.